Hello, friends and fiends, whichever reason you might be here for, be welcome. I'm Letty. You are in my house, so you should probably know that. And today I wanted to talk to you about the books that I read in April. I had a really rough reading year in 2024. It was not good. In fact, I surpassed the amount of books that I read in all of 2024 in April. So clearly, I was not doing great reading-wise. I do think, my relationship to reading is often very good, like, indictment or diagnosis of my relationship to the world. And a big part of why I read so little last year was because I kind of had constant, like, brain fog and uncertainty and anxiety. And I guess I was scared that, like, the time it takes for you to get fully engrossed in a book would be enough time for me to fully confront my thoughts. In the end, it really is that damn phone. But it was not all bad last year. In fact, I had many amazing experiences last year, and I do think a big part of why I slowed down my reading so much was because I was having a good time, actually. I traveled a lot last year, I entered a new relationship, so all of those things were taking up mental and timely, what is the word? Anyway, a lot of the real estate of my time. I had a pleasant reading month in April. I thought I'd share that pleasantness with you guys. And here are the 9 books that I read in April. I actually read most of this in March, and it is The Ladies of Great Gatsby by Susanna Clarke. Susanna Clarke famously wrote, what's it called? Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I always think one of those names has a doctor in front. I guess because I think of, like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've actually been wanting to read Susanna Clarke for a while. She also wrote Piranesi, I'm pretty sure, which is a book I've heard a lot of good things about. I'm really drawn to The Ladies of Great Gatsby because, one, the cover is really cute, and most importantly, what's said about it on the back, because the very first, like, review is an unholy alliance of Austen and Angela Carter. And that is exactly how you sell a book to me. Like, that is insanely Letty coded. I do feel like I've been hunting down the kick I got from Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber in several other collections of fantasy short stories. And I haven't and probably never will get that exact same kick. But I have had success with collections such as Patricia McKillop's Dreams of Distant Shores, and I really wanted to get the same feeling from this. So I was super excited to get into The Ladies of Great Gatsby. It's actually set in the same like world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a kind of like Regency / Victorian era England, but with magic and fairies. I've actually read other books that have their world building like exactly like that. For example, Half a Soul from Olivia Atwater. It's very much like Bridgerton meets fairies. Extra excited for this because I'd heard, in relation to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, that Susanna Clarke attempts more to actually delve into that, like, Jane Austen style of writing, and to really utilize rather than sort of ignore or alter the norms of the time. Like an Austen writing style plus fairies plus like a sort of feminist edge to it. Exactly what I desired. And this did deliver on page, and I did like this. I would never say I didn't like this. I think she's a very good writer. I liked a lot of the imagery she used, a lot of the themes she touched on, but somehow this just didn't have it for me. I don't know why, and I do think a part of that is the fact that, like, very early on there is like a mention of Neil Gaiman I think in the acknowledgements, and then later on there is a short story here that is literally written in the same world as Stardust. I have never read Neil Gaiman. That's not true. I've read a bit of Neil Gaiman and I didn't like it. I always thought it came across very try-hard. Specific way men who think they're very self-righteous write sometimes, especially when it's like fantasy that is so like get your head out of your own ass. And Neil Gaiman was always that to me, and then everything that came out about him came out. I am never going to give him another try. I was incredibly disturbed by the allegations against him and just kind of the looming presence of him in this book, which is obviously not Susanna Clarke's fault, and I'm not at all trying to imply it is. People always want to bring women into men's sins just because they're somehow associated with them. But he is mentioned like twice in this book, and there's a whole short story that is based upon his work. I don't think it was only that. I think somehow all of these stories felt like very interesting exercises and included plenty of elements to keep me engaged and interest, but none of them stuck the landing like that. Or rather, they did stick the landing. I just didn't think the routine was all it could have been in a way. Read a book like that, a book I could have written or wish I'd written, like for example The Bloody Chamber, I'm often like struck by this intense, bittersweet feeling that I can really like physically feel in my heart. That is a mix of envy and also a profound joy that this exists and that I get to exist in a world that allows for this sort of thought. And with this, I never had a like, and I was never pierced by the arrow of her words. I hope you guys cannot hear our Roomba that is currently Roombaing around in the house. It's not actually a Roomba, it's like a second-rate vacuuming robot. But it did make me quite upset, also because I have been feeling with some books this year that even though I'm reading more and I'm having more joy in reading, I have read quite a few books that just left me very despondent, and I much prefer hating a book and wanting to burn it after I read it than just feeling indifferent towards it. I think it's very sad to feel indifference towards literature sometimes. I don't think a book I hated could ever be a waste of time because it's telling me something very profound about myself. But a book that I just feel nothing towards, why did I do all that? Why did I? That's the one thing, like one moment where I have the feeling of wasting my time with literature. And I wouldn't go as far as to say this about this one. Like this was fun, but I wish it had been just more. I wish it had more muchness. It was The Ladies of Great Gatsby by Susanna Clarke, and then the next book I read was a reread, although I read this like a very long time ago, and that was Anne of Green Gables by Lucy, is it Maud? Yes, Lucy Maud Montgomery. I read this book when I was much younger, like maybe 13, at the school library, but for some reason, I guess my attention was just drawn elsewhere. And since it was at the library, like I could only read it during recess, so I guess I moved very slowly. I only ever got like halfway through. The book follows Anne from the moment she gets to Green Gables to like after she has gone to basically college. Not that familiar with like late 19th century Canadian school systems, so forgive me. But yeah, I never reached the part where she actually leaves and goes to college. Also the part where she like reaches 16, I think, and becomes a bit of a matured version of her younger Anne. So in my mind, I always retained her as that little fiery, unpredictable, always getting herself into scrapes Anne. And I loved her and held her very dearly. But it was also a very special experience to finally get to see her grow up a bit more. Coming of age tales always make me so sad. I think I'm very attached to, I don't know, I think I'm just always very affected by the fact of the passing of time and of the change inherent to the human experience. This also comes up in the later book that I read last month. The fact that life is just a cycle of like things never being the same for better or for worse is always not scary, but like touching to me. I think, you know, it's the great beauty and the great sorrow of human life. And yeah, so Anne of Green Gables actually made me so emotional. It's such a beautiful book. I love the descriptions of nature in it. It really makes me want to go to Prince Edward Island. I don't have to explain what Anne of Green Gables is because it's such a popular book, but I will anyway. So Anne of Green Gables is the story of Anne Shirley, an orphan with a penchant for getting into scrapes, who gets adopted to this couple of childless siblings in a small town in Prince Edward Island. They're much older, kind of grumpy people, but she really opens up their hearts, and it's basically the story of all of them growing up together and of her impact in this town through her like uniqueness and her imagination especially. It's such a beautiful tale of like the rights of little girls to be loud and expressive, and I always loved that so much. I think Anne is often misrepresented. For example, there's the show Anne with an E that I did like when it came out, but it kind of does paint Anne, I think, in a slightly more unflattering light than the book. Makes her a bit more rash when she isn't. She's pretty even-tempered except for when people mention her looks, which she's so protective of. She really is like a very, and she also is in the show, but I think in the book especially, such a like soft-hearted person. She has such a positive impact on people around her. She just really like paints the world in brighter colors and makes every room she enters in brighter, and it's so lovely to like follow this beautiful figure who also does make mistakes. So reading her as someone much older now, as a proper adult, it was also a new experience because I looked at Anne not necessarily as a peer, but as like a representation of my older self, and also just a representation of all the little girls in the world that I want to take care of. I also listened to this mostly on audiobook. I did read especially the end on just like paper, but I mostly read it on audiobook while walking in the park, and it was also a really lovely experience to kind of save it for those moments and get to watch the new season bloom every time in tandem with Anne, basically, because the book does encompass all the seasons of the year. So I got to enjoy beautiful nature while reading about beautiful nature through the beautiful words of Montgomery. It was actually quite funny because starting with Anne of Green Gables, I kind of read 3 books in chronological order, and it created this very interesting experience of like the chronology of dreaming in the early 20th century, late 19th century, basically the before and after of the First World War without ever actually touching the First World War. So it kind of like just remained as a ghost there, but all of the 3 books kind of had to do with dreaming and ascending above one's station or realizing one's dreams despite social like barrier. Gables, it is a children's book, and so it's a largely like positive, happy story of just the scrapes children get into, and it doesn't touch on like the socio-political situation of Canada at that time in the world. But it's a surprisingly political book. There are quite a few mentions, like direct mentions to politics, and it does in a way say a lot about women's place in society, or at least what Montgomery thought that place should be. And Anne, being this orphan who, you know, gets to Green Gables in this tiny dress that doesn't fit her, underfed, underloved, mistreated all her life, and then kind of reaches a position of respect in her society, of respect among her peers, reaches higher education. It is a bit of a story of her social ascension. The book I read after Anne was Maurice by E.M. Forster, which was my second E.M. Forster. I had read A Room with a View before, which is quite a different book from this one. I loved A Room with a View, and I also loved Maurice, even though at the beginning I found it quite hard to get into. Maurice is the story of the titular character, Maurice, who is this young boy from a very respectable and wealthy British family getting into university and his adult life. I think the part where he was at school still, like everything before he went to, is that Cambridge or Oxford actually? I think it's Cambridge. So basically before he gets to Cambridge, all of that part was a little bit harder for me to connect with because it felt like such like an accurate portrayal of the life of a young privileged man in like 1910s Britain, and like I don't know, it was just too British for me. So much slang and like so many specificities to the British way of life, and their sort of weird social games that they play over there. Also felt like very male, which is not something I particularly like to say about books because I think it can sound very like bioessentialist and weird, but in this sense I do think it makes sense. Like it was very boyish. It smelled like a classroom full of boys. I don't think books ever have a responsibility to make me relate to them. I hate that perspective on literature, but it did make it a bit harder for me to connect at the very beginning. Maurice is also just a person who I felt was very far away from me. Unlike Anne, his personality and his outlook on life was very foreign to me, and I think also to E.M. Forster, because he does say in his afterword, I think, that he wanted to create a character that was very far away from him, that was very physical, where he was more intellectual, that was like beautiful and accepted in society and vaguely cruel as a result of that, but which did have one similarity, one very major similarity with E.M. Forster, which was that he was gay. The book was actually written in like 1914, I believe, between 1913 and 1914, but was only published after Ian Forster had died because he couldn't reveal himself as a homosexual. So it is very much a look inside what it meant to be a gay man in the very early 20th century. The book never reaches the war, and it is in fact a very specific representation of crystallization of the world that existed and ceased to exist during the First World War. What happens is Maurice meets this boy, Clyde, in Cambridge, and they fall in love. Clyde is a more intellectual, more airy person than Maurice, and he comes from a wealthier, more aristocratic family as well. And it is in those moments where Maurice visits Clyde at his home, at his estate, one might say, that I especially felt this looming presence of the First World War because of the clear decay, both physical of that estate and cultural, social of that position in society. It's very much a book not just about transgression through sexuality, but also of kind of social transgression as initiated by that transgression of sexuality. How loving differently, loving wrongly according to the current social expectations can actually lead you into greater social transgressions that free you from the limitations of an incredibly stratified, extremely limited society. It's a love story. It's incredibly sad. It's written very beautifully. It's a happy end, but not quite how you imagine it. There's this quote, basically Maurice has always felt very far away, very disconnected from life, and as if he was just following the path that people put in front of him. And then when he finally realizes what he feels for Clyde, there's this line, "But his heart had lit, never to be quenched again, and one thing in him at last was real." This quote to me is so gorgeous because it represents something in Maurice that is not just the alienation from yourself and your body that is caused by being queer in a homophobic society, but also how being a privileged person in an incredibly unfair, unjust society actually also alienates you from yourself, because you become completely defined by and fearsome of your position. It's not comparable to the literal limitations that the less privileged will experience in this society, but the limitations of imagination, of love, of truth that are imposed to the elite are massive. And I do believe this is a very beautiful portrayal of how queerness also leads to other forms of transgression and of liberation. And then we're gonna skip the First World War and get all the way to the Roaring 20s with the next book I read, which was The Great Gatsby. I highlighted this line from it that I always write a quote with the book when I write down what I read. And there are so many iconic lines from The Great Gatsby, but one of the ones that really stuck with me was when Daisy says, right at the beginning, she says to Nick, "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" I think that's so representative of what The Great Gatsby is as a book. I don't know if I'd heard negative things from other people, but I was a bit scared of not liking The Great Gatsby. And while it didn't become one of my favorite books, I did really enjoy it, and I thought it was very good for what it was. And especially as the crowning jewel of this trio of books that I ended up reading chronologically, it was very interesting. I knew, of course, the broad strokes of The Great Gatsby. It's a story told by Nick, which is kind of like an observant narrator who gets involved in this world of wealth and treachery when he moves to the West Egg. Which one was the rich one, the West or the East? I think he was in the West Egg, which is basically this spot in New Jersey, I think. His cousin, who is much wealthier, Daisy, lives, as well as this mysterious man who is his neighbor, Jay Gatsby, and throws this incredible, extravagant parties. I thought Gatsby was such a beautiful character, and also, again, this representation of the tension between the world pre-World War I and the world post-World War I. Birth of the American dream, as opposed to what I read in Maurice, this incredibly, tense and restricted British society versus Roaring 20s, quote-unquote liberation, quote-unquote more social mobility, the promise of so many beautiful things, which often turns out to be hollow. Such an interesting point in this triangulation of desire, of desiring above one's station, and of like what wealth and social stratification does to people, not just those who are obviously suffering under the restraints of the system, i.e. the poorer people, such as Great Gatsby once was. Spoiler, I guess, but it's the Great Gatsby. I don't know. But also what it does to the souls and the minds of those who are rotting under the weight of their own decadence, like Daisy Buchanan and Tom. I have also always been fascinated by just the idea of a party, what parties do to human beings, what we do at parties, and I think this is such an interesting book in that sphere. There's the famous line that Jordan says that's like, oh, I much prefer larger parties, you never have any privacy in small ones, which I fully agree with, first of all. But it's also very interesting in terms of transgression, of what the 1920s were or what they represent to us today as this period, again, of liberation, of wildness, of rejoicing post-war, of opportunity for everyone. Big quotes in that one. And what a party is, what it means, how someone can have a specific social position elsewhere, but then suddenly in a party that can change entirely based on how they represent themselves or how they perform, which is very much what Great Gatsby is doing, because he might be inferior to the people of the East Egg in real life. He might not be as certain, as wealthy, as respected as Daisy Buchanan or Tom Buchanan, but in his parties he is king, and that is such an addictive feeling, but also a very dangerous one when it doesn't necessarily translate into providing you everything you want, i.e. Daisy. But yeah, I did really like The Great Gatsby, and I thought it was very, very interesting. I have a few quotes that I want to look at, if I can find them, that I put together from those 3 books. I am not in any way, by the way, trying to imply that I made this like crazy discovery. You can connect any books together, especially if they are from around the same era, and the theme of like dreaming above one's station and you know, pure human desire versus the limitations of society. That's not like a hard thing to find, but I just thought it was a big coincidence that I read those one next to the other, because it was completely coincidental, and they ended up creating this very interesting, again, chronology of desire in the early 20th century, or rather like in the time spans surrounding the First World War. I find the quotes because I think I put them on Instagram stories, so they've disappeared, but 2 of them I do have here are a moment at the end of Anne of Green Gables when Anne kind of has to give up one of her dreams for the sake of duty. And she says to Marilla, I'm just going to take this day off to visit all the dear old spots and hunt up my own old dreams. And then I have this quote from Maurice, which is, beautiful conventions received them, while beyond the barrier Maurice wandered, the wrong words on his lips and the wrong desires in his heart, and his arms full of air. Next up, I read, or rather listened to, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen for the millionth time. Quite a long time since I read it, actually, so I was quite excited to get back to it. I primarily picked it up because I needed a new audiobook for my park wanderings after Anne of Green Gables, and it's the 20th anniversary of the 2005 film adaptation, so I was like, might as well reread it. It was brilliant as ever, Jane. They will never outdo you. It was somehow more romantic than I remembered. I think the very first time I read it, I was surprised at how, in my opinion then, sort of like less intense Darcy's first proposal was, because obviously it was less intense than 2005 movie, because that's crazy intense. And then in my like, what, 14-year-old mind, I guess I was like, oh, this was way less of like a thing. But then when I reread it this time, I was like, wait, it was quite a bit of a thing. Like, it was intense, it was very much there. I love Austen, I love her as a romance author, and I primarily love her as an incredibly biting social critic. I don't have much more to say about Pride and Prejudice because I feel like it's just like all obvious somehow, except I guess the people who don't like Jane Austen, which are very sad people indeed. Afterwards, I read Anne of Avonlea, which is the follow-up. I'm gonna fall off the bed again. I can feel myself falling slowly. Partly read this as an audiobook, but also mostly just regular old reading. I want to make it clear that I have nothing against audiobooks, and in fact I think people who claim like want to purport themselves as these like great intellectual writers and then say audiobooks aren't real reading are so crazy. Like, I have no other word for that, because that's how humans have been reading. Like, oral storytelling is such an integral part of the human experience and of the development of literature, and claiming that it is in any way not real writing or real reading is so crazy to me. People who are very like anal about how they quantify books that they've read, people who say rereads aren't new reads, it's like, are you reading at all? At all? Or are you just like passively consuming the specific or like straight up information that books provide you? Because if you don't think every time you read a book it's a completely new book, well, obviously it doesn't have to be completely, but it's a new book, a new experience, then you're not reading appropriately. I'm sorry, that's just crazy. But yeah, moving on. Audiobooks are not to blame for the fact that I personally can't absorb as much of the book as I would with regular old on paper reading. It is my fault. I have a bad attention span. I get confused when birds fly by. And I think as someone who really cares about prose and style, as opposed to other people who might be more interested in the general machinations of the plot, obviously I'm also interested in that, but I have such a like, I almost want to say objectified, like that sounds negative, but that's not what I mean. Really engage with the word itself beyond just what the word is telling me. And really like rereading, untangling sentences, really getting a very close relationship with the prose, which I'm sure you can do with audiobooks. I'm also just inexperienced in audiobooks, I guess, but for some books, like there are some books that I could never read as an audiobook because I would need to really look at those words and be able to have like a physical relationship with them. For Anne of Avonlea, that was not necessary. I very much got and absorbed and had a beautiful experience with the book, even if I listened to the audiobook for a big part of it, and I loved this book. As I said, I had read Anne of Green Gables before, but I had never ever touched Anne of Avonlea. This book pretty much picks up with Anne very near or like a season after the end of the last book. Spoiler for the end of Anne of Green Gables, beginning now. At the end of the first book, Matthew dies, which creates of course a big issue for Anne and Marilla, who greatly depended on him as the guy who actually did the farming. Big financial stress on them, besides all the general stress of grief. And so Anne, who had just won a scholarship to go do what she really wanted to, which was study English at university, decides to give that up and follow her filial duty and stay with Marilla to take care of the farm, which was a very beautiful ending, which I really loved. We have such a vilification of duty in our current society, I think. So devoted to comfort, to individualism, to the commodification of human experiences. And I do love a book that, you know, puts its foot down and is like, no, your duty to your family is important. It can be more important than your personal pleasure. I think some people might take that in a slightly like anti-feminist turn, but I really don't think that's what Montgomery was saying with the ending at all. Anyway, Anne decides to stay in Avonlea, help with the farm, and become a teacher, which she does. And this book is her from like 16 to 18, I believe, doing her teaching, learning what teaching is and what it is to her, and also making new friends around the island. I think I liked this one more than Anne of Green Gables. I think that's probably because of the age thing. When I was 13, maybe I would still have counted Anne of Green Gables as my favorite because she was my peer at that point. But Anne of Avonlea is an older, more mature version of Anne, a more mature version of a story that deals a bit more profoundly with grief and loss and aging and the fear of the future. I never find Anne annoying in the first book, but she can be a bit exasperating because she is a child. So you don't really have that in the second book because she is a young lady now. I find the writing in this one to be even more beautiful. There's a specific chapter that I've been coming back to and rereading. It's called The Golden Picnic. And it's basically Anne and the girls go out for a picnic in spring. And there's this line that's like, I should have wished to be born in spring. It must be so lovely to see the flowers and think that you're like their foster sister. And I was like, ugh, that's so lovely. And Anne is complaining in this chapter that her birthday's in March, like mine, because it's not as nice as spring. And it's like, girl, it's not my fault that you're Canadian, okay? March is spring. What quote did I write for Anne of Avonlea? It was, that is one good thing about this world. There are always sure to be more springs. The next read was a pretty random one. It's the short story by Mary Shelley called The Mortal Immortal. It's about a guy who's immortal. I read this because there's this quote that I see a couple of times on Pinterest. I think it's originally in like a Tumblr post that someone screenshotted, and it's the dark-eyed, dark-haired girl of enchanting smile and fawn-like step. That sentence does not represent the vibe of the short story at all. I didn't really think the story was anything special. It's nice, capable of prose as you would expect of Mary Shelley, but I think it's one of the short stories she wrote for this one magazine, like a commission or something, and not saying that that can't be good and impactful at all, but I do think maybe she was trying to make a quick buck because there's nothing special about this one. It's a very standard, like, oh, immortality can be hard thing. Next up, I finished a new Patricia A. McKillop book to put under my belt, and that was Umbria and Shadow. I really wanted to read another McKillop because I was just in the vibe, and I think I chose Umbria and Shadow because I thought the cover was incredibly beautiful, which it is. I really like this book, but I feel kind of weird about it. I don't know if it's just like my mentality while reading it, if I was a bit somewhere else, but I didn't connect with it quite as much. The thing with McKillop is that I have read some of her books that I thought, like, her books kind of exist in this like scale of strangeness, and Winter Rose, for example, is quite a strange book, or Something Rich and Strange, which is a novella, also quite strange. And then she has other stories that are a little bit more understandable, more self-contained, like, in my opinion, The Bell at Sealy Head. And I do like this side more. I like her weirder stuff more. Umbrean Shadow was kind of simultaneously pretty weird and also more of the like explainable tales like Bell at Sealy Head. So I ended up not being quite sure on how to feel. Basically the story of this city, the city-state called Umbria, and the prince that rules it has just died. One of the main characters is Lydia, which was the prince's mistress and is subsequently thrown out into the street by this kind of evil stepmother, or more like an evil great aunt character called Domina Pearl. A bunch of very mysterious and colorful characters that get involved in kind of trying to overthrow Domina Pearl, and also figure out this ancient tale that there is like a parallel shadow city to Umbria. Gets pretty weird, gets pretty strange, which I liked. I really like cities in fantasy, like city-states. I think it's a really cool like world building thing that always works and that I always enjoy. I like the characters, I felt for them deeply, but I also sometimes was kind of just like, what is going on exactly? Will we ever get it? I think maybe it's just that when a book is really strange, it works mostly in symbols, right? And you have to very personally connect with those symbols in a way to feel strongly about it. I guess I just didn't as much in this book as I did, for example, with Winter Rose. Okay, finally, the last book that I read in April. I finished, like, I read the very last bit today, which is the 1st of March, but I'm counting it towards April because I mostly read it in April. Is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This is also a reread. This is one of my favorite books. I read this actually because I'm kind of planning I'm planning a video of recommendations for weird fantasy books. Not necessarily weird, because I wouldn't really describe The Last Unicorn as weird, even though it certainly breaks with a lot of the conventions that people expect from fantasy nowadays. But basically fantasy that I feel respects the heart of what I think the fantasy genre is. And The Last Unicorn is very much a book that I would put on this list, but I hadn't read it in a pretty long time, so I decided it earned a reread. I read most of this book in one day, yesterday, because it is such a fast read. I really think like once you start, you can't put it down. It's so enchanting. It really wraps itself around you, like the smell of an old forest. Last Unicorn is a story about the last unicorn. It's basically about this unicorn who lives in a wood and has been chilling there for a very long time, when she kind of accidentally finds out that she's the last unicorn in the world. And as you might expect, she's very disturbed by this, as you probably would if you were like hanging out in a cottage in the woods and suddenly discovered all other human beings had disappeared. This leads her on a quest for her lost kin, and on this quest she meets colorful characters such as Schmendrick, the very poor magician, and Molly Gruel, who is like this older woman who has become very disillusioned and now kind of works as a cook for this band of robbers who like to think that they're like Robin Hood characters, even though they're like standard thieves. But besides the fact that it's an incredibly technically competent, stylistically gorgeous, just like inherently endearing story, I think it's especially special for me because I love unicorns. It's kind of faux pas, very like old news to say that you are passionate about the subject of girlhood, whatever that might mean these days. But I really am. I have always been very disturbed in a way by this transition from girl to woman and what that means in a world that has such unflattering views on the group of women and what it means to kind of go from this sort of ambiguous, androgynous space that does contain a bit of safety in it towards the dangerous world of adulthood when you are a member of an oppressed gender. When I was a little girl, I was very confused about my relationship to gender, as I still am, but it was more sharp then because I think it came with this fear of time passing and the fact that my allocation as like securely belonging to the gender of woman would come with the fact of adulthood and with the loss of all of these things that I viewed as kind of inherent to childhood or youth and that I valued so greatly. Now that I'm kind of on the other side of that, I do see that like one, the awful things that people associate with women, like treachery, lasciviousness, stupidity, futility, all of these things, like they're not my cross to bear, they're those people's. I think of something like C.S. Lewis' Narnia and the character of Susan, how she can't enter Narnia anymore because she becomes entranced with the veils and delusions of the sinful womanhood. That kind of thing is so present in stories and was so upsetting to me as a little girl, as I think it is to many other little girls of the world. I wanted to remain true and pure and honest and in love with the world and protected by it, and the fact that I could become estranged from its magic by growing up, that frightened me so much. Not only growing up, but experiencing womanhood, I guess. I think it's very foolish when people pretend that there aren't still so many negative connotations to just being a woman, because for example, men don't often call themselves boys or speak of boyhood if it isn't strictly about a time in their lives when they were very young. Men talk of themselves as men. Women, they almost need an euphemism. The woman is Eve. The woman is treacherous. The woman is the downfall of men. She is Susan, who can't return to Narnia anymore, who doesn't have imagination, who doesn't have access to magic, who doesn't have this mythological connection to nature as the girl does. She stinks of perfume and she wears too much makeup to hide the horror of her decaying self, because the second that women touch knowledge, touch experience, they become ruined. This myth of the girl who dreams, who is connected to magic but not to true wildness, who is beautiful without noticing it, is crowned by her humility, because if she knew that she was beautiful, she might wield it as a weapon, but she has no weapons. If she has any wit, it's merely a sort of passing ornament. She doesn't have true wisdom because she doesn't have experience. Because if she did, she would no longer be pure. She would suddenly be banished from the realm of the beautiful, the pure, and the sacred. In truth, if you've ever met a little girl, they can be such disgusting beings, which, thank God, I want us to conserve the right of little girls to be evil, mean, disgusting, have flaws, to be lunatics, as children should have the right to be, because they are experiencing this incredibly traumatic thing of discovering what the world is. That whole thing, that dichotomy, that completely false narrative, in my opinion, is why women speak so much of girlhood without specifically referring to their early youth. They want to stretch the identity of girl as far as it can go, because there is safety in it. Because if you can somehow attach yourself to the idea of the girl, you can attempt to swerve away from all the horrible narratives that are created around your real identity, which is that of the woman. Now I understand profoundly this impulse to protect yourself by naming yourself an eternal girl, by being frightened of the idea of womanhood, by wanting to be always maiden, never crone. I think it's very counterproductive. I think it's very cowardly. And I think if we keep stretching this idea of girlhood to protect ourselves against the narratives that are created around the position of woman, we will never dismantle those. I think ignoring your position in the political oppressed class of woman in favor of this eternal dream of childhood and the protections that come with that will bite you in the ass. Completely forgot what I was talking about originally. Oh yes, unicorns, girlhood, all of that stuff. The unicorn has long been a representation of female purity. There's this like ancient myth that unicorns would only come to virgin girls, who called them. They were this physical embodiment of virginity. That has always disgusted me profoundly, the idea that anything mythical, anything ancient, anything so beautiful and so connected to nature's beauty would ever care about that, has always given me the heebie-jeebies. So unicorns as an image were always very dear to me. I loved the kind of wild beauty they represented, this like delicacy of spring that is not brought upon by forced manners, but rather a reverence and respect for everything around you. And I fantasized always of being chosen by this beautiful mythical character who would recognize in me a purity and a love for the world that could equal its own. The Last Unicorn became a very dear book to me for how it uses the figure of the unicorn in a way that is not at all that like weird patriarchal story, but rather a very interesting and sardonic look into magic and magic's position in a world that is slowly adopting modern values. It's a very beautiful exploration of the fantasy genre itself, of stories and storytelling, but also of what it means to be human and how important humans have always found the impossible. Also, like, so beautifully written. It manages to be very, like, to have this music of a legend, while also being very funny in many ways, being very irreverent. It's also just that I think it's very hard to write anything ugly when you're writing about a unicorn. Like, the very first sentence is, "The unicorn lived in a lilac wood, and she lived all alone." Such a simple string of words, but the presence of the unicorn in this wood immediately makes it sacred. She was very old, though she did not know it, and she was no longer the careless color of sea foam, but rather the color of snow falling on a moonlit night. I don't think I could ever see her closely, however close she came. She has a newness, everything is for the first time. See how she moves, how she walks, how she turns her head. All for the first time anyone has ever done these things. See how she draws her breath and lets it go again, as though no one else in the world knew that air was good. It is all for her. If I learned that she had been born this very morning, I would only be surprised that she was so old.